Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to Psychology Is. I'm Nick Fortino, host of the podcast, and today I have with me a very special guest. This is Ellen Galinsky. Welcome, Ellen.
It's very special to be with you, Nick.
It's special to be with you too. I
Thank
want
you.
to give audience members a sense of who you are, if they don't already know. So basically, I can't really summarize that. Ellen's resume, your resume is incredibly robust. And so I encourage people to visit your website at ellengalinsky.com to learn more about your background, because I can't do justice to that background in this quick introduction. But I will say a few things that you've done so many interesting and impactful things. You've had so many professional endeavors that I find to be so interesting and that have been so impactful in the field of psychology, in just the general education around parenting. And you've been president of multiple organizations, prolific author, most recently of the books Mind in the Making, which became a best-selling book on, early learning, that the New York Times described as an iconic parenting manual. And your new book, The Breakthrough Years, which synthesizes a vast array of research and presents data from 3 original studies. And this has already, came out in March, and it's been critically acclaimed already. Dan Siegel, who I really admire, described the book as a masterpiece. And I don't think he would use that word lightly. So congratulations, on the impact that you've had on the field and on this new fantastic book.
Thank you. When I heard that from Dan Siegel, I practically couldn't talk for a day.
That's an appropriate response.
I know how thoughtful he is about what he says.
Yes.
And I couldn't have asked for anything more.
Along with the things I've mentioned, you've also been, a public figure. You've been a presenter at White House conferences. You've been featured regularly in the media, including appearances on Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Oprah Winfrey Show. One of your career highlights that stands out to me is serving as a parent expert in the Mr. Rogers Talks to Parents TV series. So I actually just wanted to ask you, before we launch into the content of the new book here, what was it like to work with Mr. Rogers and his team?
Well, first it was just incredible to be invited. When I didn't know them, I didn't approach them. I had just out of the blue got a call and then was asked to be interviewed by the psychiatrist he worked with most regularly, Margaret McFarland. And I felt that I knew what I was talking about, so I was not particularly, I always get a little nervous, but I wasn't freaked out completely. I should have been freaked out completely because it was the most terrifying 3 hours that I probably ever spent. She grilled me on everything, just grilled me, pushed. And that I made it through that hurdle was pretty amazing. And then to go and work closely with Fred, who became a close personal friend.
Oh, yeah?
After that experience, yes. When I used to go, I'm from West Virginia, and when I would go home to see my mother, there was no direct flight from where I lived to Charleston, West Virginia. So I would take a flight to Pittsburgh and, leave the plane, run to Family Communications, spend a couple of hours with Fred and Bill Eisler and the crew at Family Communications, and then run back to the airport and get on the plane and go home. So I just so valued Fred and Joanne Rogers and the whole team I worked with. With Fred, what you saw on television is exactly what he was like.
You remember?
When he first took me out for lunch, he took me to the club that he always went to for lunch, and he ordered Jell-O. And I thought, What would Mr. Rogers eat for lunch? Jell-O. Of course he would eat Jell-O. It just was exactly what he was like. He was
Wow.
very caring. When my mother was in the hospital once, he just did everything he could to help to make sure that it was okay. Just a very caring man. He asked me with another person to help figure out what his legacy should be when he took Mr. Rogers off the off
Mhm.
air for a while. Now it's back, but
But yeah,
um, it just a very important relationship in my life, and I'm and he introduced me to my editor, the editor whom I've had
yeah,
ever since. Not directly, but he was Fred's editor. And when I met
yeah.
him at the launch of a series of books for Fred, I went, I want to work with you.
Delivery.
So we have ever since.
Wow. Well, I think people will be encouraged and maybe almost relieved to know that Mr. Rogers really was as he appeared on TV. That's good to know.
It was funny.
Some people have a carefully crafted persona of being so kind and wise, but no, this was the real thing.
No, he was deeply thoughtful. He worked with Margaret McFarland on every single word he said in the television show. I worked with him on some of the shows, and it was very, very, very thoughtful and very deliberately crafted to help kids be the best that they could be, to help parents be the best that they could be. Just, it's not easy. What he was
Mm,
trying to do was not easy. And
right.
people made a lot of fun of him and that sort of thing. He knew that. And, but he didn't understand it. One of my favorite experiences with him was when Saturday Night Live was making a lot of fun of him. And I was one of my, flyby stops to Pittsburgh. So I came to see him, and he was sitting in his office, and he had the television all cued, and he wanted me to watch it. And then he turned to me and he said, "Ellen, why would people do such a thing?" You know, he was really, he didn't understand it. And he was trying to understand it because he didn't want to react out of fear or anger or retribution or any of those things. And eventually he became friends with, you know, the person who was playing him and
Of
Eddie
course.
Murphy. He gave him, Eddie Murphy, I think, gave Fred a leather jacket,
Dude,
and Fred wore it really proudly. You want another Mr. Rogers story? I'll tell you another one.
I would love one.
Okay. So he would do flybys to see me too. And one day I got a message that he was in New York and he'd like to come to my office. Now, in my office, I had a number of young people who had dropped out of school or were having trouble, whom we were having worked with us as interns. And they were kind of had a rough life and weren't so touchy-feely.
Right.
And so I thought, oh my God, Fred is coming to my office. These kids are going to tear him up.
Yeah.
What is this going to be like? And I didn't say anything to them. I didn't say, be on your good behavior or anything. I didn't do anything like that. But I just said, Fred is coming and he wants to meet you. And these young people went nuts. I mean,
Yeah.
it was as if, I don't know who, in my era, it would have been a Beatle, but
Mhm.
Elvis Presley, the Beatles, um, uh, you know, the
Justin
most
Timberlake
famous.
would be my era.
Yes, just whoever is the most famous rock star you
Yeah.
couldn't believe you actually met
Hmm.
walking into my office, and
Wow.
these kids sat and talked to him for a very long time, so respectful, so
Dang.
reverential. And he was to them. They had the best conversation. It was just a wonderful visit, and I had frankly been nervous about it.
Hmm. Incredibly heartwarming. There's just certain people that bring the best out of others, and he
Yeah,
seems to be the
he did.
epitome of that.
He did. You mentioned my being president of an organization, and I had been president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is the largest group of professional educators. Not when I was president, but another time we invited Fred to speak, and and so I was sitting in the front, and I turned around and I looked at the aisles, and maybe they were 8,000 people there. I don't know, a lot of people, a lot of teachers,
Yeah.
early childhood teachers, and they were literally, because they weren't allowed to walk up to the front, they were on their hands and knees crawling up to the front. It was like this sea of teachers, on their hands and knees crawling up to get close to the front so that when he stood up and left, maybe they could meet him.
Oh my
Just,
goodness. They were trying to
I
like
just,
stay down out of people's line of sight, I'm gathering, or something
well,
like that.
security was going to stop them from doing
Okay, I
it.
see.
I don't know. I don't
Wow.
remember what the security was like, honestly. I just remember that they were, you know, crawling up, lots of them, and,
Incredible.
you know, trying to stay out of sight so that they didn't get stopped.
I love that. Yeah, a rock star of kindness. I think about,
Yes.
I think about my mom all the time. She passed, and I
Sorry.
just think about her all the time. And I think I often describe to people that she was like, if you have like the equivalent of an Olympic gold medalist at whatever event, she was like the Olympic gold medalist of being loving and
Oh,
compassionate. And
oh,
how,
wonderful.
how incredibly fortunate for my brothers and I to be raised by her and my dad. She was just an amazing person. So I think I say that because I think of Mr. Rogers as kind of like an Olympic gold medalist of personability and kindness and warmth.
He was absolutely, and you could tease him. He
Mm,
had a sense of humor. His relationship with Bill Eisler, who remains a good friend, adore Bill Eisler, was a back and forth. Bill would say, "Oh, cut that out," or "Oh, Fred, you're making me sick. It's too corny," whatever he would say, and it would just go back and forth with just a lot of love between them.
Beautiful.
It was just totally fun to watch.
Beautiful.
I mean, I just felt when they chose me, I I was doing a lot of wonderful things at the time, but I knew that experience was going to change my life in incredible ways. I just couldn't believe that it had happened to me, and it did.
Deservedly so.
Thank you.
Well, as we begin to launch in, and thank you for sharing your personal connection with Mr. Rogers. That was special to hear. I've never met someone who knew him personally. Um, so as we launch in to talking about the breakthrough years, I know many people who have interviewed you because I always do my homework on my guests, and so I watch some of your interviews with others, and many of them are quick to tell you that they themselves are a parent, and I'm one of them. I will also be forthcoming that I'm a parent, and I have an 11-year-old and a 3-year-old, and so that 11-year-old is on the precipice of these glorious years. And I just love about your book several things. One, just the framing of the teenage phase of development. And I want to read just a quick little part from your introduction. You say, I call this study the breakthrough years because of the enormous promise of these years to shape positive development. It is clear, you say, that most of us don't understand normal adolescent development, which in turn seriously inhibits our ability to help young people be and become all they can be. And I thought it was subtle but powerful, that last phrase, to help young people be and become. You didn't just say to help young people become, which I think is kind of how we tend to think, that Because teenage years, you're just becoming. You're just an immature adult. You're just in this sort of transitory phase toward adulthood. But in that phrase, as subtle as it is, it really communicates that this is already a whole person. This person is already um, deserves to be as they are, be accepted as they are, not as they are going to become. So all to say, just that framing of this phase of life having enormous promise. I really love that. I also love, just as I, recommend this book to all our listeners here, it's incredibly digestible. The way it's
Yeah.
structured, it's 500 plus pages, but it can be distilled into these kind of into these kind of five main messages, which will be the focus and structure of our conversation today. But then I love qualitative researchers and mixed methods researchers like yourself, civic researchers like yourself. And so qualitative research, if anyone doesn't know, that's when you interview people. That's when you get people's personal account in their own words of their subjective experience. And that always really humanizes research. And so you have so many quotes from teenagers and researchers, and then just the way you have bullet points throughout the book and everything. It's just very digestible.
Okay.
It's not like a daunting read. It's very enjoyable. And it becomes really a manual that you can refer back to. So I really appreciate it. And I know that I'll be referring back to it throughout my life as I parent children and just as a psychologist who's fascinated with development.
Thank you.
So tell
Can I
me,
just can
please,
I
yeah.
just say a few things? One is that I have been bothered by our relentless focus professionally on readiness, because readiness doesn't let us be where we are.
Yes.
So I did, for not this study, for another study that I was doing with kids this age, I remember doing a focus group or group interview with teenagers in right outside of Boston, and they were on a rant about readiness.
Right.
They said, you say these are the best years of our lives, but you don't let us live them. You're always telling us that we should be preparing for the future. And I think we should be preparing for the future. Absolutely. This is the transition between childhood and adulthood. So we need to help kids get ready for the future. But we also need to understand why they are who they are at this stage. And I called it the breakthrough years because one of the first researchers whom I interviewed talked about the fact that these are make or break years. And make or break sounded a little too dire, like screw it up and it's forever screwed up, because life always, as you know, as a psychologist, always there are resets or there can be resets. And so I just hate the sort of language that is deterministic.
Right.
But breakthrough, and my editor said, come on, everybody knows teenagers are scary and awful and, whatever. And I was like, yeah, if we think about them that way, we're not going to help them be or become who they can be. You're part of the problem. And one other thing about the length of the book, I did not intend to write a long book. I know that people like real quick books, small books, handouts. I've done a lot of work with the business community, put it all on one page. But young people wanted me to tell their stories, and their stories are so amazing. The stories of the researchers and of the kids whom I interviewed are just so compelling that it, unfortunately, in some ways, to me, because I didn't want to write a long book, ended up being a long book. But then, so I worked really hard on trying to make, if it's going to be comprehensive, it's going to be a scientific framework, which it is. Then I knew that I needed to make it like the Netflix series of books. It's something that you do. You're not supposed to just sit down and read it all the way through. sort of like Dr. Spock was 900 pages when my mother was having children. She didn't sit down and read Dr. Spock word for word.
Right.
I'm not a Dr. Spock. I did know him though. We could talk about
Wow.
him too.
Right.
but it's meant to be like the Netflix series on teenagers.
That's a good way to describe it. That's how it comes across. You can take it piece by piece, and in a way, like each message is like a standalone episode. And it all connects very nicely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many directions we can go, but let's just, so that listeners have context of the genesis of this book and all of the research that went into it, can you briefly describe the process of conducting the studies and writing the book?
Sure. I started, I was, you said I've done a lot of different things. I think of my life as following one question all my life, which is how to help kids grow and thrive. Yeah. And to do that, I do what's called civic science research, which means that I don't do studies about people. I find out what they want to know. They're part of asking the questions and figuring out how to disseminate their results. So I'd spent my life in early childhood and on adults, because I've done research on work and family life. If you're going to study how kids are going to grow and thrive, you need to be studying and working with their parents. Yeah. I am a parent too, and I do have an 11-year-old grandson, like 11-year-old like you. So I was missing the middle. I was missing adolescence, and I really didn't know the research on adolescence when I started in 2015. So I read about 200 studies, figuring out, just to get the lay of the land, like travel books, when you go through all these travel books and you figure out, okay, well, 3 people said it, this is maybe where I'll go, or this person really intrigues me because it builds on something that I found in the early years. So then I went out and talked to 38 14 to 18-year-olds from all over the country, even some who are not from this country, and asked them a series of open-ended questions like, what I'm writing a book on adolescence, and what do you think would be important to say? What do you think adults should know about people your age? Which is a question that I ask in the study. If you had one wish to improve the lives of people your age, what would that wish be? I asked them, I'm going to interview researchers. What should I be asking them? And it, completely different direction. The research, you could put the research, and the research in this field, you could put it over here, because what young people wanted me to find out about was not what many people study. And they wanted to know why people don't like teenagers. They wanted me to find out their conceptions of adolescence, how we see adolescence. So then I had picked the researchers whom I wanted to interview, and I interviewed and on Zoom or filmed close to 45 researchers. I read hundreds more, but I had in-depth conversations with 45 leading adolescent researchers, largely neuroscientists, because I'm particularly interested in the connection between the brain and how we act and what we do, how we feel. So I'm looking at developmental psychology, but also looking at neuroscience and social psychology and, everything, sociology, whatever, anthropology. We went into all those fields. Yeah. And then I pulled out 60 young people and parents from the national sample and interviewed them. Those are the stories in the book, to better understand what I'd found in the research and in the my own study, the nationally representative study of close to 2009 to 19-year-olds. Then I'm probably getting you tired here. Then the pandemic happened, so I went back to see how they were doing, and if what we had found out earlier was predictive of who was having trouble and who wasn't during the pandemic. And then we did a behavioral study on executive function skills, because I'm very, very interested in executive function skills, and that was the major subject of Mind in the Making. Yeah. So that was my 9 years.
What a what an amazing effort. I mean,
I did have a
and
job, so maybe I could have done it faster, but
that constitutes the job, I'd say.
yeah.
um, well,
I mean, I did
I
have another job.
oh, you did have another
I was
job.
working. Yes. Oh, yeah, I was
Oh
working.
my gosh!
Yeah, I had to do this, early in the morning.
Wow, I'm impressed and inspired. And again, like we now you have the product, so I'm sure you're so proud of this, and
I did it.
you did
When
it.
I
You
got to
did it.
the end, I went, whoa.
Oh my goodness, I
Sometimes I
bet.
didn't know.
Wow. So since you mentioned it, I know there's much to say, but if you could answer in, kind of briefly, what did you learn about the teenager's brain? What were some of the most interesting findings about the teenager's brain that you think people should know?
I think we need a new scientific story about the adolescent brain and adolescent development. The story is, if people know, it's in the popular literature. It's not just in the research studies. Is that the reward system in adolescence develops faster than the cognitive control system. So adolescents, the analogy that's sometimes used is that adolescents are like a car where you've got the pedal to the metal, full on running wild, and the brakes don't quite work.
Yeah.
That is the story that is most told, that the prefrontal cortex is undeveloped, underdeveloped, unfinished, whatever. Um, and um, and that was the story that I set out to particularly understand in the beginning, because that was so dominated the research in the field. What I found was that is in part, yes, like any story, it has a truth in it. If you took an average group of adolescents and and you looked at the prefrontal cortex, which is the reasoning, thinking part of the brain, and you took the reward center, and you looked at their development, you would see that on average, the prefrontal cortex was developing more slowly than the reward system. However, it's like looking at a group of seventh graders all stand in a line getting ready to go to gym or something. Imagine them walking in a group of seventh graders. You're going to have some real little ones. You're going to have some real big ones. You're going to have some in the middle. You're going to have some who look completely like adults. You're going to have some who look like little kids. Well, we both have sixth graders, so we know the gamut, of kids, our kids' ages. And so averages mask the more important story. The more important story in the brain development is that that for many, many kids, the prefrontal cortex, I don't know, there are no definitive studies, so you can't say what percentage, but in maybe half, maybe 2/3, maybe less. I don't, no one has done huge studies like that. The thinking part of, the prefrontal cortex is just as developed as the reward system. That's number one. Number two, the prefrontal, so that there's huge differences, but it's not. And the second thing that's important is that it depends that the use of reasoning and thinking, or what I would call executive function skills, the skills that we use to reach a goal, to do anything deliberately, to remember, to use self-control, to reflect, and those sorts of things, depend on the context. Are my dogs too loud?
No, I think
My dogs aren't bothering you. Okay.
not
Speaking of
bothering me at all.
prefrontal cortex attacking me. Um,
Right.
um, so it depends on the context, and it's only when things are when it's very emotional that you kids may not make the decisions that we wish that they made. So then you have to look further at that. And what is going on is that adolescents are supposed to be emotional
Mm.
because the task of this age is to begin to move out from your home, to move out further into the world. You are moving into adulthood. And we wouldn't do it unless we were primed to explore.
Mm.
Every species, every culture, our brains are wired to explore.
Mm.
And how else would we know if we're safe or not? How else would we know if we're good people we want to be with if we didn't have a strong emotional reaction to them? So adolescents are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing at this age.
Mm.
And very few of them, most of the studies on adolescents have been on negative risks, taking negative risks. And very few, proportionally speaking, adolescents actually do those crazy things that we so stereotypically think of them doing. When we asked parents, it was, 10, 15, 12% of parents who reported that their kids made risky decisions.
Mm.
So a small number, proportionally speaking, 9 out of 10 don't, or 8 out of 10 don't. And so, but they are supposed to explore. They are supposed to, and to feel things deeply. That's a biological necessity. I call it a developmental necessity in the book. How do I know that we don't understand it? I'm not making that up. I'm not being judgmental. I ask parents for one word to describe the teenage brain or phrase, and the most frequent word was immature. So that was 11%, and another 8% used words that mean immature, unfinished, incomplete, underdeveloped, undeveloped, words like that. And so what it tells me is that we don't understand that they're supposed to be doing this. This is what, it's really a positive thing. The bird wouldn't leave the nest. The bird, it's really pretty cozy in that nest, unless we were primed biologically to move out, to explore. So it's a very good thing. And I think that I'm just hopeful that and it can be scary for us as parents. So I understand why, we see them as incomplete adults. I mean, like, we know better. So why would you do if they do things like the "what were you thinking" moments? But I think if understanding development is going to make a big difference. And it's not that they don't feel fear. They do feel fear. They feel even more afraid than we do. Again, their emotions are high. Can be low, it can be high. So it's important for us to understand both how we see adolescents and what they're primed to do.
Mm-hmm. This leads me to one of the questions I wanted to make sure and to ask you. So just to give a little context for the question, I am very critical of the way that people, and especially children, are so quickly diagnosed as having mental disorders. And then, of course, typically also prescribed, some type of psychiatric drug for that. And I understand that it's kind of a separate conversation to talk about the most extreme cases, but the rate at which kids and adolescents and adults too are diagnosed with all the various disorders, especially including, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, some of these, which are very commonly diagnosed in teenagers. Like I said, I'm very critical of that. And I think in many cases, it's being done very inappropriately. And that, to me, is a framing of a person's behavior and emotional activity that is pathologizing. It's the opposite of what you're saying. So and forgive me if I missed it in the book, if you did speak to this, but I would love to hear you kind of just respond to this. What are your thoughts about, given everything you know about what we should expect from adolescents' emotional activity and behavior, and how often they are diagnosed as having a disorder when they exhibit such emotionality?
I think it's hard for teenagers to know with whether what they feel is normal. I was at a school last week in Washington, D.C., where a young woman, I was meeting with the leaders of the school, the kids who are the leaders of the school, told me that she was very emotional and she really did wonder if she was okay. And her parents called her, a drama queen and over emotional and those sorts of things, which she hated. But I'm sure that they were afraid too, and they were wondering if it was okay. And I think when we are told that we have a mental health crisis among teenagers, and I'm not putting that down, because I think we have to take real mental health problems very seriously. But it's in the general culture, and that when you have, the thing that makes me crazy is that when books become bestsellers called The Anxious Generation, which is to me a pathologizing of a whole generation. The main thing that kids told me that they didn't want to be labeled, stereotyped, generalized, seen negatively.
Right.
I too worry very much. I think, as a parent of a child, I'd be very careful to not do that, to not over pathologize or to jump to labeling or medication too fast. It can be extremely helpful for those who need it. So if for kids who need it, it can be good. But I think we need to work on building kids' strengths. We need to work on preventing this. We need to stop our labeling of teenagers in such negative ways. I think we need to be cautious about overprescribing and, again, labeling ourselves or our kids as having a mental health disorder.
Yeah.
But again, I know, and I talk to kids and families where there were very real problems, and good. We don't. And I also consulted last year for a year to the Agency for Children and Families at HHS, where we worked on mental health issues to the Undersecretary of Youth Mental Health, and spent a year with a lot of people who were trying to help the mental health system be better. It's just, it's so hard if you have a kid who really does have a problem to get the right help. It's so hard. Or if you don't have money to keep to get it, to keep it, there's such a shortage of real help. And then then you hear horror stories of things that, I did when I was working there, of just people's horrible experience with the mental health system. And then wonderful if they finally find someone who's good, or if they do find someone who's good. So it's, we're just in tricky terrain here, and we need to be very careful.
Indeed we are. And I definitely am sensitive to just to how difficult it can be for parents to discern, where's the line we draw here, or what is within the scope of expected natural behavior, given the developmental phase and given the circumstances that the person is in, and what is in need of attention, of professional attention. So yeah, I wish everyone clarity in that regard. So
it's really hard. I mean, when you talk to people in the middle of it, it's so confusing and so hard. Everyone wants to do the right thing, and it's, all the families I've ever talked to want to do the right thing anyway.
And I suppose what I interpret you as saying is that perhaps the scope for, let's say, just emotionality and impulsivity and behaviors like slamming doors and overreacting and yelling or hitting your brother, that level of emotionality, like, we can expect a high level of emotionality. That is not necessarily a sign that is going to be a hyper emotional, irrational adult, but that it is to be expected at this developmental phase.
Yeah, and
And
I think two things. One is that we need to give kids opportunities for positive risk.
mm,
We need to give kids physical activities. We need to give them, I mean, my grandson, he's not into it as much anymore, but he spent he's into soccer big time, but he spent a lot of time the year before last, and last year doing ninja climbing.
mm,
I mean, whew, is that scary? And that is so good, having something
yes,
that's safe. He was in all those harnesses, but having something that really pushed him is exactly whatever it is that pushes you. For my own son, it was music.
mm,
Just having music. He is a musician. He grew up to be a musician,
mm,
but he was really challenged by it. It was scary. He went off to Europe with a group to perform. you know, and it was having those kinds of adventures. We need to make sure that kids, they are born to explore. We need to give them good opportunities to explore, and then we need to help them be helpers. I
yeah,
think for anyone who is, let me just put it in another way. The young people whom I interviewed who had serious mental health challenges found that a very important route to recovery was helping other people.
mm,
We all have a need to contribute. I think that is a basic psychological need
yeah,
that we have to matter, to make a difference. And so helping our kids be helpers of others is another way, I think, a prevention. Both of these
yeah.
are prevention strategies.
I love
Um,
that. I mean,
Positive risk and helping our kids be helpers.
absolutely. I love it. Both of those. Positive risk. I mean, for my son, it's dirt biking. And he's
Oh,
gotten
wow.
me back. He's gotten me back into dirt biking throughout my adolescence. I played a lot of sports and also rode dirt bikes. And so he's gotten me back into that too. But that's certainly, partly because he's a burgeoning adolescent and partly because of his personality profile. He has this certain hunger for risk
Yeah.
that I think is, very healthy. Actually, it's adventurous is ultimately what it is.
Well,
And then, yeah, I love what you said. You highlight. So let me just read the messages that you communicate in this book. You're kind of distilled main findings that the messages, let's say, that parents really need to hear are teenagers want us to understand their development and they want to understand their own development. They want us to listen and talk with them, not at them. They don't want to be stereotyped or negatively labeled in any way. They're trying to understand themselves and their own needs. And then that teenagers are drawn to learn life and learning skills. So those were the main messages. And then, of course, you provide evidence for each one of those and quotes for each one of those. And then in the fourth one, which is again, teenagers say, we are trying to understand ourselves and our needs. And then you go on to identify these needs, which, as you say, totally apply to everybody, but perhaps are particularly important for teenagers. And those needs are to have caring connections, to have agency, to experience mastery, to develop a sense of identity, and to have purpose. And so I feel like what you just said about helping our adolescents become helpers, I think that really instills perhaps all five of, I think it can meet all five of those needs, really, but especially perhaps purpose. Um, so I would love to just kind of hear you, just stream of consciousness, speak to these five needs and how, as parents or anyone who cares for an adolescent, how can we help facilitate meeting these needs?
um, this was a real aha moment for me in doing the research because I had been looking to understand the brain development, and there was the notion that there was a mismatch between in the development, one part of the brain developing faster than the other. But when I looked at where the brains of adolescents were more activated than younger children or slightly older adults,
Mhm.
that it was around times when they were having very specific experiences, like being rejected. A friend breaks up with you, your girlfriend, boyfriend breaks up with you. It was around not being treated with respect. Think what a big word the word "dis" is in adolescence. Good. It was around not being able to be who you are, whom you feel like you are. It was around not belonging, fitting in, feeling comfortable in a group, not feeling a part of the group you were with. And I went, whoa, that's the mismatch. That's the mismatch between what we need and the experiences we have, which led me to a theory in psychology that's really quite well known and very well studied called self-determination theory, which posits that just like we have the need for food and water and shelter, we have psychological needs. And you just listed the ones that I think are most important based on the research on adolescence. And these are needs for us at any time. I mean, I thought of when I was looking at the need to belong, how before the pandemic, I ended up having an infection that they thought was a very contagious infection. And I got put into isolation very fast, boom, into the hospital, whoop, into, isolation and cut off from my world, like so fast. And then all of a sudden there were all these people whom I never met before who I depended on. And it felt like junior high school again.
Yeah.
First day of school, you don't know anyone, like you're going to sit with at lunch. And we just have such a need. I worked really hard at trying to connect to these nurses, asking them about their family, if, looking at, anything that I could to connect with them personally so that I could feel like I belonged. And I think that even though in my normal life, I don't walk around saying, do I belong or don't I belong? But I certainly do if I'm in a new situation like that. And we all have situations like that. I've jumped in and out of fields my whole professional life. And so I'm always walking into rooms where I don't know many people and having to figure out how to fit in, how to belong. Fitting in and belonging are different, but how to make that happen. And so I think that was just a wonderful way of making sense of the research, not just making sense of it. I believe it's true. And I think it's so important. If we truly understood that we all have a need to belong, if we truly understood that we all have a need to both feel competent, but to be challenged, not like, oh, you're so good at something, but to, and these are needs that we have that other people have to fulfill for us. I can want to belong like crazy in that hospital room, but if they're, too busy, not nice, work in a harsh culture, I'm not going to feel like I belong no matter what handstands I do, to try to belong. So these are things that we, the environment, have to give. And because I'm an educator by background, I immediately thought of schools. And if we knew that it was our job in part to create environments, and it's not coddling kids, but to create environments where kids felt that they were belonged, where they felt that they were part of the group that they were in, then we would have a very different system for learning. And I found when these needs were met, because I assessed them as one does with a self-report, questionnaire to what, how often do you feel that your family, you feel you belong with your family and your friends and the people in school and the people in out of school activities and the people online. And when each of these 5 needs were met, kids did really well during the pandemic. They did not have the kind of depression or anxiety or stress that we saw in the literature. So these are ingredients for thriving. And if we can understand that. And then I had another huge aha, which is I've done research on the workforce and workplace for many years. We did the largest nationally representative study of the U.S. workforce for 3 decades. And I all of a sudden saw, it was like putting on a new set of glasses. I saw the responses to that study in a whole new way, because the questions that we asked turned out to be about needs, although I wouldn't have seen them that way when we were doing the study. I was looking at it from a different organizational psychology perspective more than a developmental perspective. But questions like, I feel a part of the group I work with, were always the ones that popped. These were the most predictive of who was stressed, who was depressed, who was, physical health, sleep problems, whatever you want to look at, engaged in work, wanting to stay on the job. All of those items were so predictive of how well people were doing.
Very interesting. And I appreciate you really emphasizing, like you even said the phrase, we, the environment, need to kind of come through. And like you're pointing out, especially with belonging, a person doesn't have total control over whether or not that need is met, because it can do everything right, but the environment can just can reject you, or just dismiss you, or ignore you, or just not appreciate you.
I mean, we can find ways to cope with situations like that, but we can't feel we belong unless other people create an environment where we do belong.
Right. I just want to touch on mastery for a moment. What does this look like when that need is fulfilled? What does the kind of ideal look like for an adolescent to fulfill this need to experience mastery?
Well, for me, I put mastery under, there were 2 sub-needs for mastery. Mm-hmm. Mastery was the concept that covered feeling competent, which is something that self-determination theory has looked at. Talking psychology speaks to you as a psychologist, but it's something that psychology has studied for a long time, that feeling competent. And it's also being challenged. It was important. Now she's leaving for good. Hey, little girl. You are so quiet all day long. Can I look what you're doing right now? I want you to see this as a miracle.
Wow.
Mom would let me touch her for a year.
Oh my goodness.
My miracle.
What a miracle indeed.
You are a miracle, but you're leaving. You're leaving.
So yeah, you're saying that mastery includes feeling competent and
challenged.
Being challenged. Yes,
it
right.
Includes being challenged, and I have a particular interest in engagement because, as I told you, I've done research on the workforce for so many years, and engagement is hugely important to employers. It's seen as a proxy for productivity, and I started this series of studies 25 years ago because I thought that I was seeing that too many kids were turned off by learning and were born to learn, and that worried me a lot. And so I've jumped in and out of understanding what is engagement for a lot of years, looking at it in lots of different ways and trying to understand it, study it, ask questions about it, do research about it, and so forth. What became clear to me in the research for the breakthrough years was that that we're engaged if we're challenged. It's not like when we're pushing ourselves, when we're trying to do something that's hard, when we're mastering something that was within our reach, but it was a push. That's when we particularly feel, if you look at the book Flow, when we feel most alive, most energized, most um, time stops. Uh,
Exactly.
and I think we need to look at mastery as both sides. It's gaining the skills, the knowledge, the competence that we need, but also being pushed,
Mm.
being challenged, being stretched to always learn to try to do something new.
Yes. And there's such a, I mean, like as some psychologists call it, the zone of proximal development, that
Yes,
sweet spot.
Galinsky. Yeah,
Yep. Where it's like challenging yet possible, and
and I
there's such a
think
thing
it's
as, go ahead, please.
well. No, I have seen one of the executive function skills. One of the important lifelong learning skills that we need is taking on challenges.
Mm.
A lot of people talk about resilience. I think we need to go further than resilience. I think we need to learn how to try that next hard thing. So I see it as both something that the environment gives us opportunities to challenge ourselves, to stretch, to grow, to learn. But I also think that we need the skill of learning how to take on something that's hard, to do something that's hard.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you also about, identity and adolescents developing a sense of identity, trying to understand themselves, trying to belong to their social world. I'm curious if you gleaned any insight about status, social status, and competition among other adolescents, and popularity, and those things that seem to matter so much to so many adolescents. Did you glean any insight related to the experience of navigating that?
Yes. Um, Social status is essential in all of us. We always want to
Yeah.
know where we stand in the power structure of the world. And and as one young man I interviewed said, we don't want to think we're uncool or anything. We want to have status. So it's something that is, I call it respect, but it's something that's really important for us to have. And there's this tension between the way the world is and the way we want the world to be. When I ask young people in my study if they had one wish that could improve the lives of people their age, the largest proportion wished that other kids would be nice. And so there is this deep yearning for niceness, kindness. On the other hand, that's not always the world that they live in. It can be. I mean, we can create environments, and I've visited schools and have seen places where it can be challenging and rigorous, and but people can row together in a sense. They can see themselves as a part of the whole and can be and be connected and caring with each other. It's very possible. Very
Yeah.
possible to change a culture of bullying to a culture of civility. It's very
Right.
possible to do that. There's a lot of research that I quote where interventions have actually done that.
Yeah.
But so you've got this tension in kids, in all of us, depending on where we work and where we live, uh, of wanting to treat each other well, and yet knowing that we don't all treat each other well. So how do we survive that?
Right.
And that's the challenge. And I think that young people face, that we all face, and I don't think that it's coddling to give kids a solid foundation in groups where people are kind to each other. I think it
Definitely
will
not.
help them in a world where sometimes people aren't kind to each other, and they know how to master that.
Right. Exactly. And as I was reading this book and obviously reflecting on it from the perspective of being a father, but actually I was reflecting on it even more so as someone who has been an adolescent, I found myself really remembering back to my experience, and I'm 38 years old now. And to be honest with you, I attribute a lot of my confidence, a lot of my success in life to that developmental phase for me going really well. You know, I have
True.
great parents. I have two brothers who are really close in age. So we kind of moved through adolescence together. And I mean, you know, I was going to mention earlier too regarding belonging that there's, of course, layers of belonging. And if that most nuclear layer of belonging is very reliable and stable, then that goes a long way. And I know that that was true for me. And then I had many layers beyond that of close friendships and healthy relationships in general. But the thing that I want to say right now, kind of about my experience in adolescence, is I think it maybe because like I had the mother I had, like I said, or whatever else. I think I realized as an adolescent that you can make being kind cool. That can be actually something that gains you status. Especially, I think, you know, I wasn't a psychologist at that point, but I think, you know, I've always had that type of intelligence, a certain social intelligence. And I think I saw clearly, whether or not I could articulate it back then, that unkindness, being mean or bullying, was so obviously compensatory. It's just how much more clearly can you signal that you're scared or that you have low self-esteem than by putting others down or trying to bully. So I think that was clear to me very early. And so for me, my brothers and my tight knit group of friends, we were cool with everybody. You know, we really were kind to people and became very popular and everything like that. And but I really attribute that adolescence going well as there being like a plethora of just really genuine, kind, positive relationships in my life. And then I
Well,
attribute, like I said, a lot of my mental health as an adult to that phase having gone really well, those needs being met, coming out of that phase with a clear sense of self, like having kind of really formed a sense of identity. So, anyway, thanks for listening
how
to
do
that
you
reflection.
react when I'm interested? I, I, it's adolescence is a sturdy base from which will help us throughout life. It's why these are breakthrough years. But
Right.
when you're in it, when you have been, I assume that sometimes in your life you're in a situation where people aren't kind, or
Mm.
where the culture uh, isn't supportive of each other and that sort of thing. How do you react? How does that
Um,
sturdy base work for you?
mm, Good question. I think first and foremost, the sturdy base translates to me interpreting that,
Hmm.
not interpreting that as personal,
Yeah.
not taking it personally, and still kind of seeing that lack of kindness as um, kind of having nothing to do with me, even if that meanness is being directed at me. So I think that's my fundamental perception.
Hmm.
So it really does, you know, that perception gives rise to, I mean, I'm not going to say I'm always compassionate. That would be nice to claim, but that's not always true. Sometimes, but sometimes I'm just dismissive. You know, that's maybe as bad as it gets. I'm just like, all right, whatever to this person. They got some stuff to figure out. And then, of course, I know it's like a cliche to say, you know, kill them with kindness type of thing, but I do find that if you double down on your kind demeanor, people's shell tends to break or their meanness kind of melts away. It can't really I find that rudeness or disrespect or meanness can't weather consistent kindness.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, if you are in a situation where that person is an authority, is it
Mm,
different?
mm. You know, I'm not thinking of a lot of examples
I've
of
been in those
personal
situations.
experiences with
I
that,
think,
luckily.
yeah, what you just described is what um, researchers would call social distancing.
Mm,
That is, or psychological distancing. you could step back and look at it from another perspective.
Yeah.
So that even if something was really hard, your understanding, your ability to understand the other person really gave you strength. And that, that's part of the sturdy base that adolescent can be, because that they can't define you.
Yes.
You have defined yourself in the person
Exactly.
that you want to be.
Well said. Yeah, exactly. How
It's
about,
really inspiring, Nick. Thank you.
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that reflection. So maybe in the final couple minutes, and I know that, before we officially started here, I was floating the idea of a part 2 to this conversation. And here at the end of this one, I'm even more inclined to have another conversation with you because, as I was saying earlier, we probably got through one small fraction of this nice thick book. So there really is so much more to talk about, but maybe if I could elicit like one last insight
Sure.
from you, it would be, I want to ask you, it's very common for parents to meet their adolescent's emotionality or rebelliousness with resistance, with anger, with frustration. So what would be your guidance? And speaking as a mother, as a grandmother, and as a researcher who has written this book and contemplated this topic, what guidance do you have for parents who are dealing with adolescents who are becoming disrespectful or rebellious or just generally angsty and emotional?
Well, I have two responses to that. One is, how do we manage our own feeling? And then what do we do? So we always have to check in on ourselves, because what we feel is what we do. What we see is what we do. So I think the question that I would ask is, if we can do what you just did, which is to step back and say, in 3 years, in 5 years, how will I feel about what I'm about to say? If we can just let ourselves pause a little bit, and so we're not so reactive, and then I think we'll be more intentional about how we talk to our kids. That said, it's hard. They can push every button. They know how to do that. They've studied us. They're good at it. And so how did I handle that as a parent? One was, I knew, like you knew, that the person is talking out of, doesn't really feel good about themselves if they're having to bully or be mean to someone else. They're compensating for bad feelings about themselves. I knew that my kids were breaking up with me, because if they were going to leave, they had to not like me a little and move on, go to college, whatever they were going to go do. And so knowing that this was just the script, in a sense, they have to break up with me, but it's not forever, gave me a little bit of perspective on it. It's also hard not to feel, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. It's because I'm experiencing this as a grandmother. And watching my daughter deal with our 11-year-old, it's hard not to feel fearful sometimes with kids. Well, that person is headed straight to juvenile delinquency school, to a life of crime, to taking drugs, to being a bad person, to not appreciating all the things we've done and all the sacrifices, all that sort of stuff. And fear, we never react well out of fear, which is what I've been thinking about lately, because we've been surrounded in the election season by a culture of fear. Fear sells. Everybody's used fear to market to us. So we have to, if we understand that we're feeling afraid, if we can just pause with that too, and again, think intentionally. So I think that there's that magic pause in, and then to give ourselves a lot of grace, because we are going to screw up a lot. We are going to say things to our kids that we wish we never said. We are going to do things to our kids that we wish we would never do. And they're making mistakes because they're learning by trial and error. And we're parents and we're growing and learning the same way that they are. I wrote a book on parent development. And we have to say, making mistakes is how we learn. It's that is the biggest impetus for learning, is a mistake. So if we've done something that we haven't liked, say, I'm sorry. Trying not to get into that endless no-win situation with kids. Now, so that's how I would handle my own feelings.
Yes. Beautiful.
And I make mistakes a lot. So just, I'm sorry, or I wish I hadn't done it that way, or, and mean it. I mean, not a lot of,
right.
I hate the word. I hate I'm sorry's if it's not really genuine.
Right.
In my own family, it just, those I'm sorry's make me crazy. Okay. So what would I do? I think that autonomy support is the best strategy for any child of any age, for anybody. So as a boss, autonomy support was the best way to manage an organization. Autonomy support means that you're the boss. You set the rules. You set the culture. You create the culture. You're not. This isn't, giving in, letting other people run things, walking all over you, any of those things. But you do so in a way that invites problem solving. Because honestly, you'll come up with a better solution if you problem solve with your kids than you tell them what to do. Because one, you're giving them skills to problem solve in the future. And two, they'll come up with really great ideas that you never would have thought of. My example from this weekend, I gave a talk in my community, and I drove one of our neighbors and my daughter into school, and my daughter was being really awful in the car. And I stopped the car, and she told her to get out, and then told her she could get back in when she could be civil, because it was not safe for me to drive with a kid doing that in the car. I just was not going to drive well. This little kid was shaking all over, like, who did I get in the car with? The one we were driving. But because her mother and I were reminiscing about this when I gave a talk in our neighborhood this weekend. But then to problem solve, like what ideas do you have to make the car ride go better? And then how would that work for you? And how would that work for me? And let's just come up with something, because I don't feel safe, and I need to be safe when I'm driving. And so, when I did that with my kids, and that was my always go-to response with my kids with a problem.
I like that
and they
a lot.
knew I meant it, and they knew we were going to do it, and they knew to be listened to. If they could come up with a good idea, and they did. They came up with much better ideas than I ever would have for solving the fighting in the backseat of the car or whatever it was.
I really like that. So I'm kind of gleaning from that, the magic pause to reflect on the questions of like, what will I think about what I'm about to say or do in 3 years from now? And also how much of my response is coming from this perhaps irrational fear. So the magic pause, and then giving yourself grace, that really speaks to me. I just feel like I'm hypercritical of myself in general, but when the stakes are as high as they can be, which I feel like
you don't script your own kids.
Exactly, right? So
you're a psychologist, and I write about kids.
Right. So we're especially accountable. But yeah, giving myself grace, I'm going to really take that to heart. And then the autonomy support, I love that. And just kind of feeling out, of course, like what is the right level of autonomy, but perhaps stretching into it more than our instinct would guide us to do. I love that. Those are good takeaways.
I think you can use autonomy with kids of all ages.
Right.
Again, you're the adult; they're not the adult, so it's limits plus autonomy.
Right.
Is the way that I think of it, and the solutions have to work for you and your child.
Right.
So you don't just try any wacky idea. You say, well, ask the child, what do you think? How would that work for me? You're teaching the skill of perspective taking. you're asking them to think as if they were you.
Right, right.
And like, you know, my daughter's always go-to answer was get rid of the brother. It's not going to work well for me.
You need a few different solutions to choose from then.
Yeah. I mean, that wasn't her always solution, but it was an occasional
That's funny.
solution, which I would always laugh at. It's like, no,
Right.
I'm actually not getting rid of him. I love him. He's staying.
That's funny. Well, this has been an honor to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for, like I said in the beginning, everything you've contributed to the
Thank you.
field of, psychology and for parents. And it's just, you're doing amazing work. So let's say until we meet again, have a wonderful period of time. And I want to say, as I always do here at the end of the episode, thank you so much to all the listeners who listened to the whole conversation. So to the Psychology is audience, we'll see you again soon. And to you, Ellen, thank you. And I hope to see you again soon as well.
I'd love that.
Awesome.